Just to kick us off, one area I think that I'm sort of feeling is maybe holding up some of the change process at the moment is this question around delinking and when it's going to happen, when the base year is likely to be, what that might mean for change at the moment. And I suppose it's, from one perspective, it might be landlords who are thinking about everything being short term, and others who are in longer term relationships thinking actually maybe now is not time to change or to plan to do it differently. I'm going to hold on and wait and see what happens with delinking. Can you share a little bit more on what you know, and then maybe a little bit of crystal ball gazing on where you think it might go?
Okay, so we are expecting the government's consultation on lump sums and delinking, and they are connected but different things towards the end of the year, as I said. So the delinking aspect of the consultation will be about no longer having to attach entitlements to land in order to get the payments, which will make life easier in terms of the way in which you apply for BPS through the 7-year transition period. And then we're going to have the lump sum element as well. Now, we're a little bit disappointed with the aspiration of Defra on this, because previously, if you look at the Health and Harmony paper from way back in February 2018, the idea was that the lump sum payment wouldn't just provide a possible route to retirement or to exit, but could also provide a sum of money for people either to invest on their farm holding or to invest off the farm holding to make themselves more sustainable and resilient into the long term. Defra has really narrowed the focus now, so it is only about exit. So they're only really interested in lump sums as an exit, which is a bit disappointing to us. They do want to try and roll it out early in the transition period, so we're looking at the first half of the transition period for the lump sum. It will be a one-off scheme, we understand. And as far as the reference periods are concerned, the one thing that Defra wants to avoid is the too long a gap between the reference period starting and reality. So we're expecting the reference period to be quite late in terms of where we are now, and maybe even as close as last year in terms of ensuring that people have already bagged decisions that they've made previously, that they're not influenced by the lump sum decisions, but it's close enough to reality to make sure there isn't too much of a lag. But we'll know a bit more, hopefully, in a month or so's time. The other two things to bear in mind is we don't know whether there's going to be a cap on the level of the lump sum payment. So people might be sitting on quite a considerable amount of BPS, but the government may decide to say, well, we're only going to give X amount as a maximum. And for those who are on smaller amounts, we don't know whether they'll give 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years of the payment of the lump sum. So that all of that is yet to be determined. And as I say, hopefully in a matter of weeks, we'll know a bit more about that.
Great, thank you, George. So just a couple of questions that have come in. So there was a question that's come in on many tenants paying high rents, really BPS being the rental equivalent. How will government ensure that the ELMs money goes to the tenant rather than the landlord?
Okay, yes, a very insightful question. And we certainly have members of the TFA who are on farm business tenancies who will say to me, look, BPS is a cost to my business because I actually have to pay rent based on BPS plus a margin for the landlord. And I understand and get that completely. For some of our AHA members, the BPS continues to be a bit of a lifeline in terms of the profitability of their business going forward. So it's a difficult one to balance in the industry. When the agriculture bill has been going through its parliamentary processes, we did table an amendment which tried to properly tie down the way in which ELMs money should be paid. Now, we said the only people who should be in receipt of the public payments for public goods money are people who are in occupation of land, taking the entrepreneurial risk for the activities on that land and a day-to-day management control. Now, the government has insisted that it will ensure that it is farmers who receive the payments and not landlords, although we've been slightly concerned just of late that the pilot, the early draft of the pilot for ELM that we've seen is suggesting that some tier 2 payments may go to other land managers, which we're very worried about in terms of the way in which ELMs are structured. So we are continuing to lobby quite strongly to make sure that the payments do go to tenant farmers rather than landlords. We know at tier 3, the government wants to do some stuff with woodland owners, which is obviously also a little bit of a worry that money might leak out of the system. So as yet, I can't give you any cast iron guarantees, but you can bet your bottom dollar that we will be lobbying hard to ensure that those payments remain in the hands of tenant farmers.
And just sort of to follow on from that, do you think then, George, that that naturally has to drive longer term tenancies? Are we going to see some of these shorter term 1 or 2 year FBTs that seem to be quite prevalent at the moment? Are they going to become less and less?
Well, I think since the 1995 Act came into existence now, 25 years ago, we've seen the average length of term routinely be less than 4 years. The only time we saw a marked increase in the length of term was when the single payment scheme was introduced, and landlords were giving individuals a longer period of time to play through their history of the SPS as it was then back in 2005. But since then we've reverted to type. Now clearly there's a lot going on in the policy environment which would in our view would incentivize the longer agreements, and as I said, some of those smarter landlords being advised by some of the smarter agents are looking at longer term agreements. Sadly, I think it'll take there'll be a bit of a lag before those less smart, less savvy landlords and agents get up with the agenda. But I think there will definitely be a move in that direction. A lot of this will depend on how the taxation environment moves as well, and we're certainly arguing for change within that. But yes, certainly if there was a time for longer term agreements, it's now.
Okay, great. Another question just come in. Is there any news on when the commercial unit test will be replaced by the suitability test?
Yeah, so the agriculture bill is in ping pong, and that is an official term between the House of Lords and the House of Commons as we speak. We're expecting royal assent for the agriculture bill towards the end of the year, and it contains the provisions which will both abolish the commercial unit test and improve the suitability test. The real end of the commercial unit test and the new suitability test has to await a set of regulations that Defra has to draw up and put before Parliament. Now, we had a meeting of the Tenancy Reform Industry Group last week where we began to plan out the process for bringing those regulations into play. The unfortunate news is that Defra isn't expected to have a legislative slot for those regulations until the middle of 2021. So I suspect it'll be the summer before we see the real death of the commercial unit test and the change in the suitability test.
Great. Hopefully that answered that question. If anybody wants any further clarification or any questions, please do drop us an email and we'll give you more details afterwards. So another question that's just come in. What do we know about the requirements for taking land out of production for ELMs? For example, on silt farms, where rents are £200+ an acre, taking land out of production didn't work with ELS, with the previous entry-level schemes, because the amount received didn't cover the loss of the land taken out of production. So people can't take land out when they can get £200 an acre for it and then not farm it. So where does that sit with ELMs going forward?
So there is a debate currently around the way in which people are rewarded for taking part in schemes. And again, those on the webinar will remember the great and worthy statements made by previous Secretaries of State and Defra indicating that we can do things differently without having the shackles of the CAP around our ankles. And we can really have a properly outcome-focused scheme rewarding farmers for the great things that they do for the environment. And then we saw the February document, which indicated that income foregone was going to be the big flag waiver, which really turned everybody off in terms of how elm might be developed. So there's still an active debate, and Greg, you referred to the paper, which isn't actually an NFU paper, it's an industry paper on the Sustainable Food and Farming Scheme that the TFA was also part of drawing up, to try and convince the government that it needs to think back to those aspirational things that it said back in 2016 and 2018 about these schemes, because the question is right. There isn't enough money and income foregone for people simply to take that land out of production. Now, taking land out of production will not be the only option with an elm. There'll be lots of other things that you'll be able to do with an elm. But frankly, we don't yet know what elm looks like, and we're only beginning to see the shape of the pilot that's going to be launched next year. So all of these questions are live and in play as we speak. And one of the reasons why we asked for a delay in moving things forward is because we know we're nowhere near ready to launch this stuff into reality. But the reality of the situation is we will be moving swiftly from next year. We will have to work with these things, but we are in ongoing talks with Defra on those issues.
I mean, just you mentioned just the pilot. Then, as far as we know, we should be learning this autumn, winter. Hopefully, the plans for the pilot with interested parties putting themselves forward next spring, summer. I've heard figures of 1,000 or so farmers into it to start the end of next year. Are the TFA, actively trying to encourage tenants to be part of that, because there could be quite a lot of the understanding of how it works delivered through that 2-3 year pilot period?
Yeah, absolutely. We want as many tenant farmers to be able to take part in the pilot as possible, and for Defra to understand where the issues are in the tenanted sector in terms of how elms plays through. So it's easy if you're an owner-occupier and you can make all of the decisions you need to make about your entry into the scheme. If you have to consult with the landlord or the landlord's agent, it could be a very different ball game altogether. I think the concern that we have, Greg, is you're right, that they're looking for 1,000 participants in the scheme. Those 1,000 participants have to be already participating within BPS and not otherwise in an agri-environment scheme. So we don't really know where these 1,000 farmers are at the moment. But hopefully we'll know a little bit more towards the end of the year about that. So yeah, the pilot is going to be really important in terms of not just understanding how the mechanics of the scheme options work, but how those schemes play out in the reality of the landlord-tenant system and wider occupation issues.
Yeah. I think that comment's interesting around not already in an agri-environment scheme, because we've seen a huge uptake this year in new schemes that would start. We actually had the first one through 3 days ago, actually the first offer for starting in 1st of January 2021. So there's less and less people who are not already in those schemes, and that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So what we previously had called the Gove guarantee, which was if you were in a legacy agri-environment scheme, you would be able to jump into elm when it was available. But we now understand that means when it's fully available from 2024. In the period between 21 and 24, when we have the pilot, people who are in legacy schemes can't get into the pilot. So it'll be interesting to see where they come from.
Yeah, great. So that's just sort of kicked off a question here from Andrew around current HLS agreement holders and extensions. Now, certainly we know that another extension is going to be offered subject to Natural England approval for another 12 months from next year. But do you know, George, whether the intention is that might continue until we get to elms? So, a year after that and after that again?
Again, Greg, all of that is up for discussion. I'm sorry I'm unable to give firm answers on that. I suspect that will not be possible. I think that the government will want to drive people towards either participating in the pilot of elm or taking part in some of the newer countryside stewardship options that they have been developing. So that's my gut feel, that I don't think those extensions will be offered going forward. But again, we need to wait and see what the final announcements are towards the end of the year.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it might have been something just to reduce the amount of administration when the department's stretched at the moment, just get some easy wins over the line. Okay. Another question, some tenancies permit agricultural land use only. Is this a concern with the current suggestions of ELMs and some tenants that are considering large-scale countryside stewardship projects, so non-food production? How does this sit going forward? And I think this has been something certainly we've had clients who have been looking to put 100% of their farm already into stewardship. that might be more of an option going forward for some with ELMs and might be encouraged. How do you think that sits, George?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, Greg, for those individuals who are looking to participate in ELM from the perspective of an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy, there will at least be the saving that you can object to the landlord's refusal to allow you in if that refusal is unreasonable. Now, for FBT tenants, there isn't the same provision within the bill, which we tried to argue in, but sadly didn't achieve the amendment that we were looking for. So there is a vulnerability amongst FBT tenants, but I suspect that as we move into the new era and the landlord community understand the extent to which they are unable to expect the same levels of rents that they probably previously had, we might see them being a bit more open-handed in relation to those consents for those types of activity. And obviously it depends on how deep you go. So if you want to rewild your farm, then it's probably unlikely that you will be deemed as a reasonable application to join a government scheme. But if you're looking to do, to do stuff in the fee margins and to manage crops in a different way, to look after your soil, to look after the water and the holding, those things can sit alongside standard agricultural use and shouldn't be deemed to be unreasonable.
Yeah, okay. Just last couple of questions have just come in, and it sort of links to rent setting. And I think one of the changes going forward will be that BPS has been set and consistent across different holdings. ELMs will be different for each holding potentially because of the way that it's been structured. So, there's going to be a lot of variability there, which I think will come down to landlord-tenant discussions as to what's going to be put in place. But there's a question that come in actually that's taking it away from ELMs and stewardship and putting it back to producing the actual crops produced. And it's saying that what does George think about rental structures that they have in other parts of Europe where rents are tendered in terms of kilograms per hectare of wheat produced? So rents go up and down in line with the wheat price. So sort of unlinked from some of the ELMs discussions we've had. Yeah,
I mean, there are some interesting things out there, and we have in the past looked at things like variable FBTs, which have varied with the price of a commodity or with a basket of commodities. So there's you might have looked at a standard wheat, barley, or seed rate rotation and did an average of those prices and did an FBT based on those. I think the problem with all of those types of arrangement is if you're only looking at one bit of the spectrum, so you're only looking at price, what happens if you have a year where the price is high because the crop tonnage is low because of poor weather or poor germination or whatever, or disease? So you might be paying a high rent because the price has gone through the roof, but actually your physical production is down because of other factors beyond your control. Or what happens if the cost side of the equation is higher than you would have expected in a normal year, and that's why the price has been driven up because costs are going up. So it's how you deal with the margin. So every time we've looked at this, we've never really been able to get away from the beauty of the phrase, the productive and related earning capacity of the holding, because that encapsulates everything that you need to be thinking about. What is the productive and related earning capacity of this holding in the hands of a prudent and willing tenant? And that takes into consideration growing conditions, the soil quality, the infrastructure on the holding, the weather that's been happening, prices as well as costs. So trying to factor it in on one element, we find is very difficult.
So I'm just unmuting. Yeah, I think that's a very rounded answer, and that certainly makes sense to me. Well, we're interested to hear whether the person who answered the question wants to come back on that one. Just one quick one that's just coming, just around ELMs and tenants improvements. Assuming that the improvement of natural capital elements within a holding will be seen as a tenant's improvement.
Okay, so this might be a bit of a long answer to this particular question, but I'll try and keep it slim. So The issue around natural capital is a developing science amongst the valuation community. And I think there is a general understanding and acceptance that natural capital has a value, but the extent to which it is a value to the land or the landlord or the incoming tenant has yet to be properly assessed. And I know that there's some work being done within the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers trying to look at issues around natural capital and to properly value these in the same way as you would a building or a slurry score or UNVs and RMVs and all of that sort of stuff. So this is an emerging valuation science, if you like, and something which hasn't yet been properly brought to fruition. But the one caveat that I would just raise is that whatever you're talking about here in terms of tenants improvements, be that physical improvements or improvements like natural capital, any grant aided element of that improvement is discounted from compensation. So if you've received grant aid, like through an agri-environment scheme, for the production of that natural capital, you're not entitled to compensation for that on the way out because it's deemed that the state has provided you a grant to produce that benefit. Therefore, that benefit should be left behind for the benefit of whoever else comes to take on that opportunity. So you do need to just be aware that grant-aided improvements, including for natural capital, don't end up in compensation to tenants at the end of tenancy.
Great. Sounds like a developing and rather complex subject. So we look forward to updates on that as they come.